Hi, it's me, Teresa, and I'm here to give you guys the talk today that's titled Evolution. Okay, so first I'm going to start by going through the outline and just talking about the different things that we're going to cover. Okay, so I'll review first off from last time, talking about the definitions of a species, a population, natural selection, and evolution. Then I'll talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, the man who we credit with the theory of evolution by natural selection. And then I'm going to talk a bit about Darwin's thought process and how he came to the conclusions that he did. And then when we're done talking with about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about various lines of evidence that we have for evolution by natural selection. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about how new species originate, some myths and misunderstandings about evolution, and finally we're going to transition into the topic for our next lecture, which is beginning with ultimate and proximate explanations for behavior. Okay, so a species, as we talked about last time, is a group of organisms that can and do mate with one another, and when they do, they produce viable offspring. That's fertile offspring, offspring that themselves are capable of producing offspring. A population is a distinct group of members of a species, usually that are separated from the other members of their species by some kind of geographic differences. They are native to different areas. So for example, there are a number of different kinds of tigers that are alive in the world today, and they are all the same species. They all are capable of interbreeding with one another, and when they do, they produce viable offspring, offspring that are themselves fertile. However, there are populations of tigers that live in different places. Siberian tigers that live up in Russia have thick fur and are suited to cold environments. We have Bengal tigers that live in India and that area. And then we have Sumatran tigers that live down in Indonesia. And though these tigers are different in their appearance, they all are of the same species. So we call those populations of tigers. In domestic animals, sometimes we refer to them as breeds. So for example, a different breed of dog. All dogs are the same species. They are capable of mating with one another and producing viable offspring, but there are obviously differences in dogs. A Chihuahua is a very different dog than a Great Dane, and we'll come back to this idea. So natural selection is this idea that different organisms survive and reproduce better than other organisms within their species. So there's differential survival among individuals within a species. Whenever you look at any species, you're going to see variability. If you look around at people you know, they're going to be different kinds of hair, different kinds of skin tone, different kinds of eye color, and all of these different variations among people, different height, different weight, and so on and so forth. And the same thing with dogs, or the same thing with tigers, or whatever kind of organism you want to look at. And so different members of that species survive and reproduce if they're more suited to a certain environment. And that's the idea of natural selection, that individuals are born and then some survive and reproduce better and some don't survive and reproduce as well. So evolution is a concept that there's a change in what really amounts to gene frequency over time. This is organic evolution. I'm not talking about evolution of, the vampire in literature or something like that. I'm talking about evolution of life, okay? Evolution of organic life. And so really what's happening, we now know, as the basis of evolution, is that different genes become more or less frequent in a population. So let's talk about that some more. But first I want to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin himself, because he is the person we credit with coming up with this theory, and he's an interesting guy. So Charles Darwin was born into a very wealthy family. They were well-to-do, and so he was going to have some kind of job as a well-to-do person in society. And first he actually started to train as a doctor, but he didn't like it very much. And so he stopped going to college for being a doctor, and he switched to theology. And he went to school actually studying religion. His degrees are in theology, in religion. And his job that he was trained to do was to be a parson, which is kind of like a priest or a minister. And that was in his denomination, his Anglican denomination. They're called parsons. And so that was what he was actually trained to be. He wasn't trained, as an evolutionist or something like this. And he also was a devoted family man. He had a wife named Emma, who he loved very much, and he was very devoted to her. And they had 10 children. Some of them didn't survive, but he was a very devoted father. And he actually wrote a lot of developmental literature. He wrote about his children. And some of the things that he's written have become really foundational for developmental psychology. So that's how much he liked his kids. So he also, after he took his trip around the world, he started to raise pigeons. And he was very interested in all of the different breeds of pigeons. And if you ever have a chance to go to a pigeon show, they have them at, what do they call it now, the San Diego County Fair. They show pigeons there everywhere. You should go and check them out, because pigeons are crazy. They have all these different weird body types with, a huge chest that puffs out, or, feathers on their feet, bizarre feathers on their head. All of these different kinds of pigeons have been bred by breeders to, look the way that they do. All right. He also was, of the upper class, and he wrote extensively. And throughout his life, his passion always was nature. He was considered a naturalist, and he was a scientist. He was accepted as a scientist at his time, and he wrote extensively on the different things that he saw and experienced in his life. So, like I say, he was a huge nature lover, and he used to go out and take various trips out into the country, and he would collect things, samples of beetles, or other kinds of small animals or plants, rocks, various things. He was very interested in all these kinds of things, and he read extensively about them. And then, at a certain point, he was asked by a man by the name of Robert Fitzroy, through his family connections. His father was Robert Darwin, and his grandfather was Erasmus Darwin, and they were all well respected in their chosen professions. And through his connections, he became a naturalist for a captain of a ship, and the captain's name was also Robert Fitzroy. And Fitzroy had a ship named the Beagle, and he asked Charles to come on his ship and be his naturalist. They were going to sail pretty much around the world, and they were going to collect various specimens to take back for museums in England. And so that was Charles' job. His job was to make lots of notes. His job was to collect lots of specimens. His job was to describe what it is he saw on this trip. And he did this very well. He also was supposed to be kind of a friend to Fitzroy. So Fitzroy, being the captain of the ship, he was among the upper class too, and the rest of the people on the ship were not, the people who worked the ship. And so he kind of wanted to have somebody that he could talk to on the voyage, and that was Charles. So they sailed all around, and did exactly what they set out to do. But Charles didn't have any kind of agenda about evolution. He didn't have any, he wasn't setting out to prove anything. He was just setting out to discover and learn and bring back these different specimens. So he saw a number of things happen on this journey. The journey, let's see, I wrote down the year right here. The journey began in 1831, and it lasted almost 5 years. And they went from England and to islands that were off the coast of Africa and down around South America, and then back around to where Australia is, around the tip of Africa, and eventually made it home. So quite a voyage. And he saw a lot of really interesting things on this voyage that influenced his way of thinking. One of the things that he saw, he was in a place called Cape Verde that was off of the coast of Africa. It's in the Atlantic Ocean, a set of islands in between Africa and South America. And when he was there, he noticed far up out of the ocean a layer of seashells, a layer of obviously animals that had been in the sea at one time, way, way, way up high, and no longer in the sea. They were in a cliff face. And that got him to thinking. And then when he got over to South America, when he was off the coast of Chile, he saw a really amazing, a series of amazing things take place. One thing he saw was an earthquake take place. And when the earthquake took place, he actually saw that after the earthquake, there were stretches of land that were now raised out of the water. Things that the day before had been submerged in water were now out of the water. And he thought, that's very interesting. And as he traveled, he found way high up in the Andes Mountains, shells and marine animals in the layers of rocks, fossils of these animals. And he was amazed. He thought, this used to be underwater, and now it's way up high on a mountain. And so this got him to thinking. And he realized that the entire continent of South America, more or less, was rising up. And these various things that he witnessed demonstrated to him that that process has been happening, and that it had been happening for some time. So 1931, he leaves. 1936, he's back to England. And in 1938, he has all of these ideas bouncing around in his head. When he was off of the coast of South America, in a place called the Galapagos Islands, he saw what have become his famous Darwin's finches. And here's the idea. All of the finches on each of the islands in the Galapagos were specialized for the kind of food that they ate on that island. They were perfectly suited to eat whatever kind of thing was on that specific island. So there were finches that had relatively large beaks for eating things like fruit. There were birds that had elongated beaks that were good for eating grubs. There were even finches that were able to use tools like a stick to dig things out of, holes in plants, things like bugs or whatever, and eat those. So wherever the animals were, they were perfectly suited to the environment there. And yet they all bore some kind of resemblance to one another, and they all kind of looked something like a regular old finch you might see on the mainland. And so that got Charles to thinking. So when he gets back in 1938, he reads a paper by a guy named Thomas Robert Malthus. and he was an economist. And he talked about how when you look at people in the economy, it seems like there's not enough to go around. There are populations of people, but there are limited resources. And so people compete with one another for these resources. And so even though Malthus was talking about the economy, Charles Darwin started to ponder these ideas in relation to organisms. And so he started to put together all of these things he'd seen, and by no means can I go into them all here. This was a journey that lasted 5 years and a lifetime of thinking and seeing nature, experiencing nature, and also being a scientist and a well-respected person at the time, well-respected writer. When he got back in 1938 and he read that, he came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection. And then he promptly did pretty much nothing with it. In 1844, he wrote an essay about it. He wrote an essay, 230-page essay about his idea. And he didn't share it with very many people, just people who were close to him. He was very much concerned about the controversy that his ideas would bring. He was aware of it. His wife was a devoutly religious woman, and he adored her, and he would never want to offend her in any way. And he did talk about his ideas with her. And he also had a lot of illnesses, and so for various reasons, the writing was slow going. So in 1844, he writes this 230-page essay. About 10 years after that, he starts breeding the pigeons. So he's got the pigeons, and he's doing that at one of his houses. And in 1858, so this is 20 years after he came up with the idea for the theory of evolution by natural selection, 20 years later, he gets contacted by a buddy who tells him about another guy named Alfred Wallace. And Alfred Wallace essentially had the exact same idea. Alfred Wallace, as their communication increased, Darwin realized that Wallace was going to scoop him. And so he very quickly published what he had written. And that book is On the Origin of Species. And it was well read. It sold out, the first printing of it. And he ended up not being able to go to one of the scientific conferences because one of his children had died of scarlet fever. And but it was decided in any event that because Darwin had come up with the idea earlier than Wallace, even though Wallace was a contemporary scientist with Darwin, they gave Darwin the credit, and they said, yes, Wallace too. He said this also, but who do we remember after all this time? Everybody knows Charles Darwin, and not everybody knows Alfred Wallace. Okay, so all of these things are happening in Charles' life, and he starts to put together the pieces of the puzzle. And I'm going to take you through the steps of how he put together the facts that he saw in the world and made very reasonable inferences about these facts, and therefore came up with this theory, this idea that has been so revolutionary in everything in science, in biology, geology, medicine, you name it, psychology. Okay, this is a set of facts right here, and from this set of facts, Darwin is going to make some very limited inferences. Limited, as you'll see, they're very reasonable, but important. Okay. So the first fact I'm going to call superfecundity. All superfecundity is this idea that organisms produce a lot of offspring. So whether you're talking about a fish, the males release a bunch of sperm, the females release a bunch of eggs, and you have many, many, many offspring that are created. Not all of them survive, obviously. All the way up to, humans. Charles Darwin had 10 children himself, but not all of them survived. So whatever organism you're looking at, you'll notice that it makes a lot of offspring. And that's the idea of superfecundity. Just this idea that organisms have tremendous reproductive capacity. But the second idea came from Thomas Malthus. And this is the idea that there are limited resources in the world. Okay? So essentially, if resources were unlimited, every organism could survive and reproduce. But resources are limited. Okay? So there's only so much food to go around. There's only so much habitat to go around. There's only so many mates to go around. Okay? So whatever kind of resource you're talking about in the world, it is limited. But if you look at population levels over time, population levels tend to stay steady over time. In other words, when organisms produce a lot of offspring, not all of them survive and reproduce. And so you might have a little uptake in a population when things are going well, and then you'll have a little downtick in the population when, resources start to become more scarce. And so population levels tend to stay steady over time. And so he put these three facts together and came up with an inference from them. And the inference he came up with was that there is a struggle for survival. So, within a species, animals struggle in order to survive and reproduce. More offspring are produced than can be accommodated by limited resources. And if you see that population levels remain steady, generally speaking, remain pretty steady over time, it indicates that there is a struggle to survive. Now, he also noticed that there were a couple of other facts. For every organism, for every trait, there are individual differences. So whether you are talking about hair color, skin color, how sharp your claws are, how big your antlers are, how thick your fur is, how fast you run, how well you can use tools. Think of any trait, both behavioral and physical, and all of these traits, there are differences in a population. When you look at a population, you'll see them. Differences in height, differences in weight, differences in every different kind of trait you can think of. And he noticed that there's a resemblance between family members. There's a resemblance from parent to offspring. Parents have children that are like them. And this is for every trait. If you have a human parent, you'll see that the child looks something like both of the parents, generally speaking. If you're talking about, let's say you're breeding dogs, and you want a dog that's a really good shepherd. You're going to breed a dog that's good at herding sheep with another dog that's good at herding sheep, and their offspring will be good at herding sheep. Okay, so there is a resemblance between parents and their offspring when it comes to all of these different traits. And so he put these two ideas together, that there are individual differences and there's a resemblance between parent and offspring. And those two ideas came together to where he figured out that traits are inherited. Meaning, there is some mechanism that is responsible for the reason that parents and offspring tend to look alike. Traits are being passed from one generation to the next generation. So pretty straightforward, right? There's a struggle to survive among species, and traits are inherited. he puts those two things together and he realizes that there's differential survival depending on inherited differences among individuals. There's differential survival depending on inherited differences among individuals. So if you're looking at individuals and you see that they have all these differences and they've been inherited from their parents, some of them survive and reproduce better, and some of them don't survive and reproduce as well. Given enough time, and that's the key insight, he realized that across many generations, species will evolve. If there are differences among individuals that are based on something they inherited from their parents, and these different individuals are struggling to survive, some are going to make it better than others. And so over the course of geologic time, and that was the key insight, how long of a period of time we're talking about? Millions of years, billions of years. You see that species evolve. Looking at the slide, the things that Darwin noticed as facts in the world, and if you were to look at the world today, you could see the same facts, is that there are a lot of organisms. They produce a lot of offspring. However, resources are limited, and you see that population levels stay steady over time. So, lots of animals, limited resources, there's a struggle for survival. There's a struggle to exist. There's competition. Then he sees that there's variations among individuals, no matter what trait you're talking about, and that individuals inherit these traits from their parents. And he put that together and came up with his idea of natural selection. Now, the key insight was how long this had been happening. And he made those insights by looking at things that he saw in the world, like seashells being at the top of the Andes Mountains. That must have taken a long time for those mountains to be built. If you think about the span of human time, you think about what seems like a long time to us. Ancient Egypt, what we call ancient Egypt, that was about 5,000 years ago. A little less than 5,000 years ago is when the pyramids were built. And that's the kind of thing that humans think of as, that's literally ancient history for us. The first writing, the first known writing besides, little tick marks for counting, the first known writing is about 5,000 years old, a little over 5,000 years old. And so that's when history begins for us, only 5,000 years ago. And when you're talking about the span of geologic time, 1,000,000 is 1,000 times 1,000. So you're talking about 5,000 years. If you're talking about 5,000,000 years, that is 1,000 times as long ago as ancient Egypt. And that's just millions. Geologic time goes across billions of years. And a billion is 1,000 times 1,000,000. So you're talking about 1,000 times 1,000 times 1,000 before you get to 1 billion. And Earth has been around for billions of years. And so over that period of time, you see organisms change. And this squared with all of the different observations that Darwin had made. Whether you're talking about the finches on the different islands, or you're talking about the seashells at the top of the Andes, or the fossils he collected. And he collected a significant number of fossils of species that are extinct, that are no longer extant on the planet. And so he realized that these things have been happening for a very, very long time. A period of time that is hard for humans to wrap our heads around. It's hard enough for us to think about 500 years, much less 5,000 years, 5,000,000 years, 5 billion years. It's a long, long time. And most people really struggle to grasp the enormity of geologic time. In any event, let me talk a little bit about the process of how evolution works at a small scale. This is the basic mechanism. And if you can understand conceptually what I'm talking about here, you understand the mechanism by which all evolution occurs, really. Okay, so let's say you have a population of beetles. And we're talking about one trait, and that's going to be the color of their exoskeleton. Okay? You look at the beetles and you see that most of them have green shells, but some of them have brown shells. And these crows are the predator that moves into an area. And when they move into the area, they start eating the food supply that's there, the beetles. And the crows are eating the beetles, and the green beetles taste better to the crows than the brown beetles. The brown beetles taste a little bit sour to the crows. So what do the crows do? They eat the green beetles and they leave the brown beetles. After a little bit of time goes by, you're going to see more and more brown beetles in the population and fewer green beetles in the population. And eventually, if this process continues, you're going to see almost all brown beetles. The green beetles will reduce in number and the brown beetles will proliferate because they are not preferred by the birds. They taste bitter to the birds for whatever reason. And so what you've seen happen over time is a change in gene frequencies. Before, the most frequent gene for shell color was the green gene color. Now, after the birds have been eating a lot of the green-shelled beetles, there's more of the allele for the brown shell. Simple as that. What I just showed you there is the idea of evolution by natural selection in a nutshell. Not a hugely difficult concept to wrap your head around. And we have seen evidence of evolution by natural selection in many different places. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. So, we have actually experimentally induced evolution in a number of species. So, for example, fruit flies. Fruit flies are a really great way to demonstrate evolution because they reproduce very, very quickly. And a number of other species we use for this, like some small fishes and such, also reproduce very quickly. You can have 20 or 30 generations of fruit flies in a year, okay? So, whereas it takes hundreds of years for humans to have that many generations, okay? So, fruit flies reproduce very, very quickly. And they've done experiments like this. They take a group of fruit flies, they're all obviously the exact same species, they're all surviving and reproducing together, they are mating and those kinds of things and producing viable offspring. And they separate this one species out into two separate tanks, okay? So this is like two different populations now. And in one of the tanks, they only provide a food source that's maltose based, okay? So a kind of sugar. And what kind of flies are going to survive and reproduce the best in that tank are the ones that are best able to digest maltose-based food. They're going to have a slight advantage. So if you're talking about their digestive systems, normally flies might encounter a number of different kinds of food, and so they'd have to digest a number of different kinds of food. But some individuals on a certain trait, like digestion, might be better at digesting maltose than others. And so they'll survive better and reproduce better. In the other tank, we don't give them any maltose. We give them a starch-based food. And it's the same kind of idea. In that tank, the generations go by, and the flies that are better able to digest the starch-based food survive and reproduce a little bit better. And after a number of generations, you can take those two separate tanks of flies now, one that's been eating maltose-based food for many generations, one that's been eating starch-based food for a number of generations, and if you reintroduce them to one another, they will no longer reproduce with one another. They have speciated. They will mate and reproduce with only the members of their group, even though you've put them back together with animals that a few generations ago, they were all the same species. So that's speciation that has occurred. And we've done this with other things in the lab, like subjecting them to hot or cold, and with other species, like I mentioned, like little fish. We also have, in addition to having been able to induce evolution in the lab by, artificially producing these selection pressures, we've seen it occur in the real world a number of times too. And one of the most famous examples are the peppered moths over in England. So you can see right here, if you look real closely, there's a peppered moth of kind of a gray spotted coloration, and then you can see much more distinctly gray or black colored moth right here. Okay, so here's how the story of the peppered moth goes. The peppered moths originally in the population, they were named peppered moths because they were the light gray ones with the little black speckles on them. And they blended in perfectly with the bark of the trees in England where they are. And so anytime you would occasionally get a moth that was darker than the other moths, one that was, more black in coloration, it would be seen by predators sooner, and therefore it would be eaten sooner. So imagine a little bird goes by. If it can't see the gray one, but it can see the darker one, it's going to eat that one. And so what you would see was that the gene frequency, there would be more of the gray moths than the black moths. But then industrialization happened in England, and there was a lot of soot being produced by the factories, and it started to cover the trunks of the trees and everything else in this black soot. And wouldn't you know it, but the moths that were black, now that had previously been at a disadvantage, blended in better. And the more peppered moths, the moths that had more gray in them, were easier to spot. So what did the birds do? They eat the ones they can see better, and the black ones survived and reproduced better. And so you saw evolution actually occur in the real world. And the story has a happy ending because England has cleaned up its act quite a lot since those days, and the trees have gone back to their original color, and again, the lighter colored moth proliferates. But that's not the only example. In the Faroe Islands, I've seen different numbers thrown about, 250 to 500 years ago, we had Europeans coming over to the Faroe Islands, and the Faroe Islands had been isolated from the mainland in terms of their organisms, their animals and plant life, for a very long time. And so there were no mice in the Faroe Islands until we brought them over. So Europeans came over to the Faroe Islands, and there's 6 different islands where the little mice that had been on the ships would get off. They would get off the ships and onto the mainland. As mice do. They get into the ships and run around on the ships and sail with the sailors across the ocean until they get to the Faroe Islands, and then they disembark along with everything else. You have to imagine they're in the food supply and everything like that. And so the little house mouse from Europe ended up on the Faroe Islands. Well, now, depending on who you talk to, 250 to 500 years later, we have distinct populations of mice on each of the islands that has apparently speciated. They are noticeably different from one another, and especially at the genetic level, which we can now look at. In fact, the house mouse that comes from Europe, their ancestors has something like 40 chromosomes, and these guys now have fewer chromosomes, 22 to 30 chromosomes. So they have speciated. And so you see different types of mice on the different Faroe Islands. Another example that has occurred in a time when we have historical records of it are the cichlids in Africa. So the cichlids in Africa, they've speciated in a number of different ways, but one of them is because there was, they call it a hybrid swarm. There was kind of an ancestral type of cichlid, a general cichlid, and they lived all together in one body of water. And then that area of Africa started to dry up. And so it split into 2 main bodies of water and then into lots of different bodies of water. And wouldn't you know it, in each of the different bodies of water, the cichlid becomes better suited over time to what's in that specific environment. They become better suited to eat whatever's in there and blend in with, or stand out, depending on what's good for their survival and reproduction. But you see all these different kinds of cichlids now in all of the different individual lakes in Africa. You can go and buy cichlids at Petco or PetSmart or wherever, the pet store, and if you do, they will kill all the other fish in the tank, and you will end up with like one, or if you're lucky, two cichlids at the end. They're kind of nasty. Okay, so those are examples of real world evidence, but we also have examples in the field of medicine. And one of the things we know about both bacteria and viruses in the field of medicine is that they evolve over time. We come up with ways of fighting them. So when you're talking about bacteria, we have antibiotics developed for fighting bacteria. And because people have used antibiotics improperly, we have evolved stronger and stronger bacteria, more and more deadly bacteria. And one of the strains is called MRSA. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. And you don't have to know that. People often mistake MRSA on their skin thinking it's a spider bite, but it's not. It's a bacterial infection, and lots of people carry it. I think most people carry it. It's really prevalent in your nose, but it can also just be on your skin. And most people's immune systems are capable of dealing with that. Most people's bodies are capable of keeping the MRSA out. However, it's particularly pervasive in places like hospitals. So imagine that you're taking antibiotics, okay? So you get a sinus infection, and you're taking antibiotics for that sinus infection. On day one, when you take your antibiotic for the sinus infection, and you have all of the bacteria in your body, which ones die the first? It's going to be the weakest ones, right? It's the weakest ones that die the first. And by weakest, I mean the ones that are most susceptible to that antibiotic. If they're very susceptible to the antibiotic, they're going to die on day one, okay? Now, day two, the next wave gets killed, okay? The next wave of those bacteria, the ones that are a little bit more resistant, they get killed. And on day three, and on day four, and so on and so forth. Now, let's say you've been given, a 10-day dose of antibiotics, but you're feeling better at day 5. Of course you are. The bacteria are being killed in your body. But there's still some that are alive, but they're not bothering you very much. Now, which ones are still alive at this point? The strongest ones, the ones that are the most resistant to the antibiotic, okay, at day 5. So you stopped taking your antibiotics. You stopped before all of them got killed. We give you a dose of antibiotics that's actually a little bit longer than you probably need to make sure all of the bacteria are killed. But you stop at day 5, and there's still some kicking around in your body. And which ones are they going to be? The strongest. Now they have survived the antibiotic, and what do? They reproduce, like living things do. And now you have a body full of really antibiotic-resistant organisms. If you're lucky, you fight them off and you recover. But you've bred a strain of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Wash them off your hands, they go into the ocean. They're all over hospitals. That's why people are always, using hand sanitizer and stuff like this. Speaking of hand sanitizer, when you use that stuff, what does it say on it? Kills 99.9% of bacteria. The 0.1% that's left, those are going to be the strongest ones, right? So by using these antibacterial products, we are killing off the weak bacteria, leaving the strong bacteria to survive and reproduce, and over time we get things like MRSA. We get bacteria that are extremely resistant to all of the antibiotics that we have. And it's a very serious situation. We have found bacteria at this point that have killed people that we do not have antibiotics that can treat that bacteria. So if it were to get out into the general population, it would kill a lot of people. And we did that by causing evolution in the bacteria. So take your antibiotics and don't use hand sanitizer. That's the moral of the story here. Okay. Now, of course, we have fossil evidence of these things. I've been talking about lab evidence, real world evidence, evidence in the medical community, and now I'm going to talk about fossils. So fossils are remains of organisms that are no longer living on Earth. Well, some of them survive in pretty similar forms, but anyways. If you look at the layers of rocks in the world, you will see that some of them contain fossils. Darwin noticed this in various places, and you can go out and see them. I've gone out and seen quite a few of them, and it's really awesome, and I strongly recommend you go somewhere where you can see fossils in the real world. But at this point, we have millions and millions of pieces of fossil evidence. And one of the things that you may occasionally hear people say who are challenging the theory of evolution by natural selection, you'll hear them say things like, there are no intermediate fossils. We don't have fossils that show us the in-between stages between one species and another species. And that's just not at all true. We have intermediate fossils for just about every organism you can imagine. So let's take, for example, whales. All right. So whales, as they look in the oceans today, may look something like a killer whale, an orca, or a baleen whale. Okay. So these are the ones that are extant on Earth today. And if you were to look at the next layer of fossils, so the closest to the top layer of fossils around the world, you would see animals that look quite a lot like whales. They're a little bit different, but you will see generally similarities in between that organism and modern day whales. And if you go a little bit back further, they look more different. And the further back you go, the deeper down underneath the ground you go to the different fossil layers, the older and older rocks, you see the organisms, they bear a resemblance to the ones that are younger than them, and they bear a resemblance to the ones that are older than them, but they're somewhere in between. And if you go back far enough, you will see that the ancestors of whales lived on land. They were four-legged animals that lived on land. And that goes perfectly with what we were talking about in the last lecture, how whales have these apparent finger bones in their flippers. And there's no reason for that to be, because a flipper can work perfectly well without the bones in that shape. But they are in that shape because we can see these ancestors. And we have intermediate species. You can see the transition is virtually seamless. And every time you hear a criticism of somebody who says, oh, but there's no intermediate fossil here, give us another 10 years and we find it. And the same is true when you look at different species of fish. So you have species of fish that eventually evolved into amphibians and eventually reptiles. And you can see every intermediate species along the way, and they are exactly where they should be in the fossil record. They are, this one's older than this one, and this one's older than this one, and so on and so forth the further back you go. Okay. We also have evidence like this for, animals that are on the land, like horses. So ancient ancestors of horses and deer were small, and they lived in forest areas, wooded jungle areas, I guess, lots of dense cover. And the ancestral horses were small and very well suited to live in this kind of situation. They had teeth suited to eat the foliage there, and they had feet suited to move about the jungle areas. And then what started to happen was that slowly over time, the climate changed. And it got drier and drier in the area where horses evolved. And so the drier it got, the more grasslands there were and the less forest there was, okay? So forest is getting scarcer, grasslands are getting more and more plentiful. And so you see these little organisms coming out to eat what is most available. And so you see animals are selected that have a body type that's good for that. For eating grasses, they have teeth specialized for that. For moving on the plains, you start to see hooves develop in the fossils. And so on and so forth. They become bigger because as you go out onto the grasslands, there's less and less cover, so it's better if you're a big animal. And so you see these gradual steps until you see the modern day horse. And you can look at the fossil record and see that the plants and other things that are in the fossil layer with these guys are the kind that you would find in a forest, and so on and so forth, until you find, you know, what looks very close to a modern day horse, and they are fully capable of living on the grasslands, quite large, with hooves and teeth developed for eating grasses, and so on and so forth. And you see all the intermediate steps represented in the fossil record. I could go on indefinitely. You could study these pieces of evidence for your entire life and not encounter all of them. There are so many fossils. You couldn't possibly even see them all in your lifetime. So it's not like we're talking about a little bit of evidence. We're talking about a lot of evidence, and it all matches up. Okay, so it will be helpful for me at this point to describe to you guys the process of creating a fossil. Okay. Fossils are not created often. Fossils, things only fossilized very rarely. So what happens to most organisms when they die is they get eaten. Something eats them. So it could be a predator, it could be a scavenger, it could be, bacteria. Whatever you're talking about, very few things actually fossilize. Most things just eventually decay away until there's nothing left. In order for a remnant of an organism to be fossilized, very specific things have to happen, okay? And this is the general idea behind the fossilization process. Okay, I'm going to show you my amazing art skills right now. So imagine that you're a dinosaur. Okay. And you have lived a very long dino life. All right? And you come down to that's an awesome dinosaur, by the way. You come down to the pond to have a drink of water. Okay? You come down to you're old dinosaur, and you come down to the pond to have a drink of water. And as you're drinking the water, you die of old age. Okay? This dinosaur, you die of old age. You can tell he's dead because he has X's for eyes. Okay, oops. So now you have a dead dinosaur in this pond. A little bit of water is coming in, and gradually over time, the sediment, the sand and the clay and stuff like that, that's being brought in to this pond starts to cover the dinosaur. And layers and layers and layers of sediment accumulate on top of the dinosaur. What happens is a process called permineralization. In which all of the pieces of the dinosaur are replaced by pieces of rock, essentially. As these layers press down on the dinosaur body, the pieces of the dinosaur itself start to decompose, and they are replaced with minerals. And the minerals are in the exact shape of the organism. And so every piece that decays away that was organic gets replaced with, or that was carbon-based, gets replaced with a little piece of a mineral. And so when you see a fossil, like a fossilized dinosaur or whatever, you're not seeing the actual bones. It's not the actual bone. A fossil is a bone-shaped rock or a footprint-shaped rock. It's rock that has replaced whatever was there. If you have a bone, it's a bone, okay? If you have, like let's say they dig up a woolly mammoth up in the permafrost, okay? They dig it out of the ice. That's an actual frozen woolly mammoth, okay, with bones and everything. That's not a fossil. A fossil has specifically gone through this process. This is extremely rare. How many animals do you know that die this way? Not most of them. Most of them are eaten. And when something is left, it's things like the biggest bones, the strongest bones, or the teeth, or shells. And so those things can get, washed into rivers and then washed into lakes, and they can accumulate at the bottom of a lake, and then this process will happen. And then you'll see kind of like a mix-up of a whole bunch of different bones of different organisms that, have just been washed down into that area. And so that's the kind of thing that you might see at Dinosaur National Monument. You have to go to Dinosaur National Monument. You are wasting your life if you don't go see Dinosaur National Monument. But it's a whole bunch of the biggest, thickest bones of various dinosaurs that all collected at the bottom of an ancient lake and were fossilized and have been exposed on the surface at this point, and you can go see them. Okay. That's how a fossil is made. It has to be in water. There have to be layers of sediment deposited on top of it. And it has to happen slowly like this over time in order for the fossilization process to even occur. And so that's very rare. And yet we have millions of pieces of evidence. Yet we have millions and millions of fossils. Okay? So even though this is very rare, it still happens often enough that we have these species represented in the fossil record, in the layers of rock. And we can date these layers of rock. And when we date the layers of rock, the ones on the top are the youngest, the ones further down are going to be older and older and older. And you see that all of the different pieces of evidence of how the species are changing over time matches up with where they should be in the various rock layers, which are called strata. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about how evolution occurs. So you'll hear sometimes people talk about micro or macro evolution, and honestly, there's no difference. The mechanism is the same. Microevolution is like the beetles in the grass. The green ones get selected against, the brown ones get selected for, or whatever. Macroevolution are species, speciating over millions of years and billions of years, okay? But it's the same mechanism. There is no difference between microevolution and macroevolution except for the time scale. All right. So that's that. Now take micro and macroevolution, set it aside. Just know that they're the same mechanism. The only difference is how long it's been. Okay. How do new species originate? How do we get these new species where we have a new organism that will not mate and reproduce with members of another species? They only will mate and reproduce with the members of their own species. How do we have all of these different things? There are two main mechanisms. The first is a slow accumulation of changes over time. Okay, so sometimes you see that happen. Sometimes in the fossil record, you'll see these very small changes happening gradually, like the example with the horses. Okay, so a very slow transition from a forest-like environment to a grasslands-like environment. And so you see little tiny changes add up over time until you see new species occur over time. So that's one way that you can get new species. Another way, and probably the most common way that speciation occurs, is through population isolation. So in this case, it hasn't been, one species slowly turning into another species over time. What it is one species is now in two different places. And so the different places have different kinds of obstacles to overcome. We call them population pressures. Okay, so you have different kinds of pressures over in the different places. Let's say that you have some kind of, let's say it's different people, and some people move over, towards one continent and other people towards another continent. Now they're in two completely different continents and time goes by. Maybe in one place it's very cold and in another place it's very hot. And so you see one group of people start to get adapted to the cold and the other group of people get adapted to the warmth, or, whatever, what have you. So there's some kind of barrier that is isolating the populations. So population isolation, the tigers are a great example. They haven't speciated yet. All the different tigers in the different populations can still mate with one another, but they often don't. Because the only time they're together is when we put them together artificially. Sumatran tiger is not anywhere near a Siberian tiger in the natural environment. So given more time, you would probably see speciation occur for those various populations. Okay. So that was the last thing I was talking about, the origin of new species. Whether you're talking about microevolution or macroevolution, it's the same mechanism, and those are the two ways that new species evolve. New species evolve through either a slow accumulation of small changes or speciation by population isolation. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about some myths and misunderstandings that people have about evolution by natural selection. The first big obstacle for most people is to grasp the vastness of geologic time. Once you realize how long species have been on the planet, organism life has been on the planet, it starts to get difficult to believe that it wouldn't change. When Charles Darwin was first proposing his ideas, a lot of people thought that the Earth was only a few thousand years old. That was definitely changing by the time Darwin came around, and people were starting to think a lot bigger than that. But not everyone. And certainly people believe that species were created the way that they were created and that they didn't change over time. And so that was Darwin's big insight, was that species were changing over time and that time was enormous. Okay, so myths and misunderstandings. There's a myth or a misunderstanding that animals do things for the survival of their species. Here we have the little lemming in the inner tube trying to survive this lemmings going over the cliff so that he can carry on the species. They don't. Animals do not do anything for the good of their species. Animals behave and animals change, and then it either works or it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time, changes to genes result in changes in the organism that are not beneficial. That, let's say that you're an organism living in the desert and something happens during meiosis and one of your gametes has an alteration that makes you have thick fur. Well, that's not going to be too good in the desert heat. But if you were a little mouse that was born up in the Arctic Circle, you're going to want to have thick fur. And so those things would be selected for. And the same is true with behavioral traits. So some organisms try various behaviors. I'm going to eat this or I'm going to eat that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And they have genes that allow them to do these behaviors. This is what we've been talking about the entire time in biopsychology, is how your genes influence your behaviors. So genes, we now know it's very obvious that genes code for things in animals like, bigger claws or sharper teeth or bigger horns. But we also know that genes code for differences in brain structures, and that the differences in brain structures lead to differences in behaviors. And then those things can either be selected for or selected against. And so no organism does anything for the benefit of their species. They do things and then it either works or it doesn't. It either works in a given environment or it doesn't. So evolution is all about reproduction. And when we talk about fitness and survival of the fittest, you may have heard this term. Fittest doesn't necessarily mean the strongest or the biggest. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it means the smallest and the easiest to, be camouflaged, or the one that's the smartest and best able to use tools, or the one that cooperates. So there are various traits that can be beneficial, that can be harmful, and they will, in a given environment, and they'll either be selected for or against. That's fitness, survival, and reproduction. Another myth that you hear people say is that there's some kind of goal or purpose or direction to evolution. Like, okay, the beaver wants to be able to cut down trees to make his dam. So he tries and tries and tries until he evolves a chainsaw hand? No, that doesn't work that way. Yeah, that would be great for the beaver to have a chainsaw hand. It would sure help him be able to chop down trees. But nature doesn't give organisms, as it says here, what they need. What happens is during meiosis, a gamete has a random mutation in its genes, and that leads to a change in the organism, and then that either works or it doesn't. If it works a little bit better, that animal will survive and reproduce a little bit better. So there is no end point. There is no one species is better than another. It's that, or one organism is better than another. Evolution doesn't talk about things in that terms. What it says is some things are more fit for a given environment, and the ones that are more fit for a given environment will survive and reproduce. And that's something that should be really apparent just by looking at the world. What life really is a big bushy mess. We are, all of us, all life forms are attempts at surviving and reproducing. Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? Does this work? Yes? Okay, you survive and reproduce. No, you don't. You don't get to pass on your genes. And what that gives us in species, the way that this process works, is because of variability. You have to have variability within a species in order for evolution to occur. If there's no variability, anything that selects against one will select against all the members of the species. So for example, this is the big problem with endangered species, like for example, cheetahs. We have pretty successful cheetah breeding programs, but our gene pool is very limited. And so there's not a lot of genetic variability among the cheetahs that are surviving. And so anything that comes in, like let's say a disease that comes in, if it kills one cheetah, it's very likely to kill all the cheetahs. And so that variation is what's necessary for evolution to occur. There have to be organisms that have a trait that allows them to differentially survive. So what is it then about human behavior or any behavior that explains what's going on? And this is the idea of proximate and ultimate explanations. Proximate explanations are explanations for behavior or physiology or whatever. Proximate explanations are explanations of what's going on right here, right now. And most of what you've learned in your psychology classes, your biology classes, your classes, up until this point, are proximate explanations for behavior. Proximate explanations for why things are the way they are. So for example, you might take one class in social psychology, and it gives you social explanations for human behavior. Then you might take another class that gives you cultural reasons for human behavior. Then you might take another class that talks about hormones and hormones, how they contribute to human behavior. And then you might have another class in neurotransmitters and how they contribute to human behavior. And you have all these classes, that you've taken all across this campus that tell you all of these different explanations for human behavior. And they are all valid. They are all valid. Okay, there's nothing about this evolutionary perspective on psychology that says that those explanations are not valid. But what we call them are proximate explanations. In other words, what is going on here that explains how the trait works? What hormones are contributing to what behavior? What social factors are contributing to what behavior? What cultural factors are contributing to what behavior? What developmental factors are contributing to a given behavior, etc. And so you can look at explanations from all those different perspectives. But what evolutionary psychology talks about are ultimate explanations. So ultimate explanations ask the question, how does this behavior contribute to survival and reproduction? That's the ultimate explanation. So you can give a social explanation or a cultural explanation or a physiological explanation or a hormonal explanation, but you can also say, well, why would that have evolved? Why would that trait have allowed an animal, an organism, to survive and reproduce better than another organism? That's proximate versus ultimate explanations. So I'm going to come back to that concept a lot during the rest of the semester. But I want to keep going on with this myths and misunderstandings about evolution. Hey, Lou, go. Okay. So some people get the Big Bang Theory mixed up in all of this. Some people, think, okay, well, some scientists say about 14 billion years ago, the universe was created. That doesn't have anything to do with evolution. Other people think that evolution says something about how organisms were created in the first place, how life first came to be. And that's not true either. The theory of evolution by natural selection says nothing about how life came to be. What the theory of evolution says is that once life came to be, however it came to be, it changed over time. And that's it. That's all that it says. So, some people think that religious views are in conflict with seeing things from an evolutionary perspective. And that's also not true. So most scientists, many that I know personally, are devoutly religious people, and they see no conflict between their understanding of the facts of the world and evolution by natural selection and their religious beliefs. In fact, if you were to look at all of the countries across the world, and they were given the following question. Let me see if I can get the exact question right here. Oops. Okay, the question was, or the statement is, human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals. Okay, human beings as we know them developed from earlier species of animals. That we have ancestors in our evolutionary tree. Okay, and blue represents people who say, yes, I agree with that, and red represents people who say, no, I don't agree with that. Almost all nations across the world overwhelmingly agree, and especially your, first world countries like Denmark, Sweden, France, Japan, Great Britain, etc. Overwhelmingly, the people say, yes, evolution is a fact. The United States, out of all the countries surveyed, and there were quite a few surveyed, is almost at the bottom of the list, with only about 40% of people saying, yes, that's a fact. Another 40% almost saying, no, I don't think that that's a fact. And, 20% somewhere in between. So we are at the bottom of the list of countries that accept the fact of the theory of evolution by natural selection. Most scientists see no conflict between their religious understandings and their philosophical beliefs and their understanding of science and evolution. Some people who don't know very much about the idea of evolution by natural selection think that animals do something during their life to change the way they physically are or the way they behave, and then that's passed on to the next generation. So Lamarck was a scientist who was living at the time that Darwin was, and he explained how animals change over time like this. Okay, he said, take the example of the giraffe. You have one animal that has a short neck and it stretches out its neck to reach the leaves during its lifetime, and then it passes that on to their children. And that's not the way it works at all. What happens is, during the process of meiosis, random mutations occur, and if one comes along that makes an animal that has a slightly longer neck, it gets to eat the food, and therefore it gets to survive and reproduce. It can reach the higher branches, and so it gets to survive and reproduce. But this happens through random mutation, slowly over time. Yeah. Not because the animal tried to get better. You know that what happens to you during your lifetime doesn't affect you at the genetic level. The only exception to this is epigenetic changes, which again don't actually change the gene structure. They just change which genes are turned on or off, and those things can change over the course of the life of the animal too, or organism. Another myth that you'll hear people say is that there are no intermediate fossils. And again, I've already covered this. There are tons of intermediate fossils for just about every organism you can imagine, and especially including humans. There are all kinds of intermediate fossils of humans represented, and we'll talk about those a lot more in the next lecture. And then the last thing, here's, I'm showing you some examples of intermediate fossils of various species. The next thing you'll hear people say is that evolution is just a theory. And when you hear people say that, that really comes from a place of not understanding what a scientific theory is. A theory in science is a statement to explain phenomenon, something that's going on in the world. Okay, some way of explaining natural behavior, some way of explaining the world as it is. And it remains a theory for as long as the evidence we bring in supports it. And the second we get a piece of evidence that doesn't, that shows that the theory is wrong, we eliminate the theory. That's what science does. We come up with explanations, we say, here's what I think is going on, and we say, this is the evidence I see that supports it. And as soon as evidence comes in that contradicts it, then we say, oh, well, I guess our theory was wrong. We have to come up with a new theory. There are millions and millions of discrete pieces of evidence for evolution by natural selection. I have been talking for a long time about just a couple of them. I've been talking about the lab evidence with the fruit flies. I've been talking about the geological evidence that Darwin saw. I've been talking about the medical evidence like the evolution of bacteria. I've been talking about real world examples that we've been able to see like the peppered moth and the Faroe Island mice and the cichlids, etc., etc. And then I've talked very briefly about a little tiny bit of the fossil record. But of course, there's much more vast stores of information that I could talk about forever. In fact, out of all of the things that I have told you in this class, I've told you a lot of things, right? And you've all taken notes on them like very dutiful students. You've all sat there and said, oh, this is how this neurotransmitter works, agonist versus antagonist, okay, GABA and glutamate and da-da-da, and you've recorded that. I've told you about neuroanatomy and how the brain is built and structured and how neurons are structured and how action potentials work, and you've written all these things down and you've assumed them to be facts. And truthfully, the amount of evidence we have for everything else I've taught you this semester is tiny. It's little tiny bits of evidence, and we've kind of all put them together into an explanation of what works. And you don't have any problem saying, okay, well, that's what we know, that's science, we know, and it's a fact. Even though the foundations of that are minuscule compared to what we know about evolution. We have millions and millions of discrete pieces of evidence for evolution by natural selection, and we don't have one piece of evidence that contradicts the theory. Not one. There has never been a piece of evidence offered by anyone that contradicts the theory of evolution by natural selection, and everybody's trying to prove it wrong. If you could be the next big thing that could come up and prove Darwin wrong, you'd be the most famous scientist in the world. It's never happened, even though we have all of these different pieces. And so even though this thing that I'm talking about in this lecture is the most widely supported theory in all of science, more widely supported than the theory of gravity, more widely supported. There are more lines of evidence, like I've told you, from medicine, from the fossil record, from labs, from the real world. More lines of evidence and things that fit in perfectly with this and don't fit in any other way. Let me give you an example, okay? Let's go over to the board right here. Okay, ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I've been talking to you guys a little bit this past semester about some different animals, we were talking about how different animals are categorized, kingdom, phylum, order, and all of this. Okay, so when we get into the groups that's mammals, we've talked about mammals and how mammals are all animals that have mammary glands that produce milk for their offspring. There are 3 different kinds of mammals on Earth right now. One group are called the monotremes. Whoops. Monotremes are animals like platypuses and spiny echidna. In fact, those are the only 2 examples of monotremes that still exist on Earth. And these animals are mammals. They do produce milk. They have a patch on their abdomen that that's bare, doesn't have a lot of hair there, and it produces a sweat that is milky. That's what milk is. Milk is modified sweat. So these animals have modified sweat glands on their abdomen that they use to produce milk for their offspring. But they lay eggs, and so they don't give live birth. The other kind of mammal we have on Earth are marsupials. Okay? And marsupials are the guys who live in Australia and that area. Marsupials are animals that have a pouch. Okay? And the baby is born like a little tiny embryo, and it crawls up the abdomen of the mom and down into her pouch, and it attaches to a nipple in there, and then they grow inside the pouch until they're ready to, come out and face the world, the little joeys. Okay, so these are guys like kangaroos and koalas and wombats and all of the mammals that live in Australia, all the mammals that are native to Australia. And then there's us, and we're placental mammals, okay? Placental mammals are most mammals that you know of, okay? These animals carry their offspring in their uterus and create a placenta for it, and the animal stays inside the mom, the baby stays inside the mom for a considerable period of time, and then when they're born more developed. Okay, so the only place that we find monotremes, like I've mentioned, are in Australia, and there's only 2 of them. Marsupials are almost exclusively isolated in Australia. The only marsupials that you find outside of that area are possums. Now, you know possums. You've probably seen them in your yard or dead on the side of the road. Possums are nasty. They're nasty, right? Okay? Well, there's a reason for that. Monotremes were the first animals to evolve in the fossil record. And at the time that monotremes evolved, they are slightly adapted from reptiles. Okay, so there were mammal-like reptiles, and the monotremes still have a lot of characteristics of reptiles. For example, laying eggs. But they developed this milky patch, and that was beneficial. It was beneficial that the mom could feed the offspring. That gave them an advantage over the other animals where the offspring either had to find their own food or the parent had to bring it back for the offspring. So it was a big advantage. And for a while, the only mammals on Earth were monotremes. Then marsupials evolved. And marsupials are a little bit better suited to this world than monotremes are. Being able to, instead of laying an egg, being able to carry the baby inside of you for even a little bit period of time. You couldn't make a placenta. Marsupials don't have a placenta. But you could develop a little bit, and then the baby would come out and attach to a nipple inside the pouch and develop from there. That was better than the system the monotremes had. And so marsupials outperformed monotremes everywhere on Earth. And at this time that this was happening, Earth was one landmass centered around the equator called Pangaea. And so all organisms were more or less on one large continent. And the monotremes, like I say, evolved first from reptiles. So after we see reptiles in the fossil record, the first mammals we see are monotremes. Then when marsupials evolved, they outcompeted all the monotremes until there were only 2 left. And those are platypus and spiny echidna. But then placental mammals evolved. And when placental mammals evolved, the pieces of the continent of Pangaea were breaking apart from one another. And one of the places that was left would go on to become Australia, would eventually, the continents move, plate tectonics. One of the pieces would eventually go on to be Australia. And marsupials had evolved there, but placental mammals evolved in the other landmass. Placental mammals evolved in the place that was separate from Australia. And when the placental mammals evolved, they outcompeted the marsupials. They were more well suited to pretty much everywhere than the marsupials. And so placental mammals outcompeted, and the only animals that you'll see now that are mammals in anywhere else in the world are going to be placental mammals. As they separated, placental mammals had already developed, and so as the land masses moved apart from one another, they all had placental mammals on them. But placental mammals never made it to Australia when this was happening. everywhere where placental mammals were, they outcompeted the marsupials, much less the monotremes. Everywhere else in the world, monotremes gone. One marsupial survived, the possum. Now, there are several species of possums in different places in the world now, but you know how badass a possum is. That's the only animal that could survive as a marsupial among placental mammals. All of the other ones died. Placental mammals took over. But Australia never evolved placental mammals. They were on a different track. And so the marsupials were the best there. And so they evolved over time into all the species that you see in Australia right now, like kangaroos and wombats and koalas. And that's why placental mammals are such a huge threat to the animals that live in Australia. Because placental mammals are just fitter animals on this earth. They are fitter mammals on this earth than marsupials. So when you get a dog or a cat or a mouse or a rabbit that accidentally comes into Australia, it wipes out the population of marsupials like that. And that's why Australia is so rigid about allowing any animals into their country. You may have heard that Johnny Depp got in a lot of trouble for bringing his Yorkie to Australia. And I've had Australian students who've said to me, oh my God, yeah, they're really, really super rigid. You can't, trying to get a cat as a pet into Australia, forget about it. It's not going to happen. Because Australia knows that any placental mammal that comes in, even if it's a mouse or a cat, even if it's small, it's going to outcompete the marsupials and decimate them. And anytime that's happened, that's exactly what's occurred. They've wiped out huge populations and it's been really problematic. Also, if you look at the rock layers that have these various animals in them and you date the rock layers, the ages add up perfectly to when we knew Pangaea was one continent and when it started to divide and then when Australia broke off. If you look at the rocks, the dates are the same. The fossil layers are the same. It all matches up. And the only thing that explains that, this is just one example. The only thing that explains this one example, all these different pieces of information, is the idea of evolution by natural selection. It's the only common thread to unite all of this information. And all of the information I've been talking about in this lecture, lab, real world, fossils, there's so much evidence. This is one tiny, tiny thing, and yet the only thing that can explain this is the theory of evolution by natural selection. Nothing else makes sense to explain all these different pieces of information. And yet, even though there are more pieces of evidence for this, this is more well established than any other thing I've talked about in this entire class, this is the only thing that I've had to justify to you. This is the only thing that semester after semester after semester I have to justify to my students that it's a fact. I have to spend an entire class or two explaining to you that evolution by natural selection is a scientific fact. Everything else you've believed, everything else that's built on much shakier foundations, pathetic little foundations compared to this, and yet you've accepted it. Why? Why do I have to do this about this topic? It makes me bananas. Now let's watch a video that says a lot of what I just said.